Every single person alive outside of Africa today shares something in common, whether they know it or not. Trace their ancestry back far enough, past every empire, every migration, every language that ever existed, and it all funnels down to the same starting point. A relatively small group of people, standing on the edge of a continent, deciding to keep walking. This is where our species began. All of it. Every human alive today, no matter where they were born, descends from populations that originated in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of that span, humans simply stayed. Africa is enormous, environmentally diverse, and for a very long time, it was more than enough. So the real question was never really, how did humans spread across the planet? It's much stranger than that. The real question is why anyone left at all, when everything they needed already existed on the continent where their entire species had evolved. The answer isn't curiosity, and it isn't some innate drive to explore. It's climate. Specifically, it's a climate system that couldn't seem to make up its mind. Northern Africa, including what is now the Sahara Desert, hasn't always looked the way it looks today. Due to slow, predictable shifts in the tilt and orbit of the Earth, a cycle scientists now call the Green Sahara Pump, this entire region has flipped repeatedly between lush, vegetated grassland, dotted with lakes and rivers, and the harsh, nearly impassable desert we associate with it now. This wasn't a one-time event. It happened again and again over tens of thousands of years, essentially opening and closing a door out of Africa on a rhythm dictated by the planet's orbit. When the door was open, the Sahara functioned as a green corridor, connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean coast and the Sinai Peninsula. Grasslands, seasonal rivers, and enough resources to support both animals and the humans following them. When the door closed, that same land became one of the most hostile environments on Earth, an effective wall that could trap or destroy anyone caught on the wrong side of it. When the rain stopped, it didn't come back quickly, and it didn't come back gently. Groups that had spread into these temporarily green corridors would have watched their environment slowly turn against them, water sources drying up, game animals moving on or dying off, and the margin for survival narrowing every season. Under that kind of pressure, staying in place wasn't necessarily the safer option. So, at various points across tens of thousands of years, small groups made a decision. Rather than wait out a drought that might last generations, they would follow the green, follow the animals, follow the water, keep moving until the environment stopped punishing them. They walked north, generation by generation, toward a narrow strip of water separating Africa from the Arabian Peninsula. Not because they had a destination in mind, because moving was, for that specific stretch of history, a better bet than standing still. We know a remarkable amount of this story because of something written directly into your own DNA, whether your ancestors made that journey or not. Every population outside of Africa carries measurably less genetic diversity than populations that remained. That's not a minor detail. It's the fingerprint of exactly what you'd expect if a small subset of a much larger population left and became the founders of everyone who came after them, generation after generation, all descending from that same narrow starting point. This wasn't even the first attempt either. Fossil evidence from sites in the Levant, in what's now Israel, shows that earlier groups of modern humans made it out of Africa tens of thousands of years before the migration that actually succeeded, potentially as early as 120,000 years ago. Sites like School and Kafsa preserve the remains of anatomically modern humans living well outside Africa, long before the successful exodus most people have actually heard of. Those earlier groups didn't fail immediately. They survived for a while, established themselves outside the continent, and then, as far as the genetic and archaeological record can tell, they simply vanished. No lasting genetic trace in modern populations, no descendants carrying their lineage forward. Whether it was climate reversing again, competition with other hominin species already established in the region, or something else entirely, those earlier attempts to leave Africa were, in the most literal sense, evolutionary dead ends. It's worth sitting with what that actually means. An entire population, generations of people who lived, raised children, and presumably believed they'd found somewhere viable, simply left no trace in the story that eventually became human history. We only know they existed because of a handful of bones that happened to survive in the right conditions for tens of thousands of years. For every population like that, there were almost certainly others that left no trace at all, not even bones, just complete and total genetic silence. Which makes the migration that did succeed, sometime around 60 to 70,000 years ago, something closer to a survivor's story than an inevitable event. It wasn't guaranteed to work. It very nearly didn't happen at all, multiple times over, before it finally did. So what was actually different about this one? Researchers point to a combination of factors rather than a single clean explanation. The timing lined up with a favorable window in that green Sahara cycle, giving the migrating groups an actual corridor rather than a dead-end desert. Population size may have played a role too. A large enough founding group has a better chance of surviving unpredictable setbacks than a handful of families traveling alone. And there's a less measurable factor that shows up again and again in these stories: accumulated knowledge. By this point, humans had spent tens of thousands of years slowly refining tools, food storage, and social cooperation. The group that finally made the crossing stick wasn't smarter than the earlier ones in any biological sense. They simply had more inherited knowledge to draw on, the accumulated trial and error of every failed attempt that came before them. At the strait now called Bab el-Mandeb, where the Red Sea narrows to its tightest point between Africa and Arabia, the crossing was still real water, still a genuine obstacle, but at certain points during low sea levels, it would have been narrow enough to attempt with simple rafts, or even, at the very lowest points, nearly walkable. This wasn't a heroic ocean voyage on the scale of the crossing to Sahul we covered in an earlier video. It was a smaller, more survivable gap. But it still required people to leave behind the only continent their species had ever known, based on nothing more than the hope that conditions on the other side would be better than the ones driving them out. This is what researchers call a founder effect, and it's still measurably visible in the genome of every single non-African person alive today. When a small group splits off from a much larger population and becomes the ancestors of everyone who follows, they only carry a fraction of the genetic diversity that existed in the original group. That reduced diversity gets passed down, generation after generation, essentially locked in from that single, narrow moment of departure. It's a strange thing to sit with. The reason your DNA, if you're not of African descent, looks statistically different from someone whose ancestors stayed isn't really about adaptation to new environments, not primarily. It's a direct echo of how few people actually made that original crossing, tens of thousands of years ago, funneling the genetic future of billions of people through one relatively narrow bottleneck. It's also worth pointing out what didn't happen, because it's easy to accidentally frame this as though everyone eventually left. They didn't. The vast majority of the human population, then and for a long time afterward, stayed in Africa. That's actually where you'd expect to find the deepest, most varied branches of the human family tree. And that's exactly what the genetic evidence shows. Populations that remained on the continent retained far more genetic diversity than any of the groups that split off and migrated outward, precisely because they were never funneled through a small founding bottleneck the way the migrants were. Leaving wasn't an upgrade, it was a gamble made by a small fraction of the total population, while the majority continued living in the environment their species had always called home. On the other side of that crossing, the migrants weren't stepping into an empty world. Arabia, and the regions beyond it, were already home to other human species. Neanderthals had been established across parts of Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years before modern humans ever arrived. And the genetic evidence is unambiguous about what happened when these two populations encountered each other. They interbred. Most people with non-African ancestry today carry measurable percentages of Neanderthal DNA, direct evidence of contact, and at least some degree of coexistence between our species and one that no longer exists. There's a more dramatic theory that occasionally gets attached to the same general period, and it's worth mentioning because it's still genuinely debated. Around 74,000 years ago, the Toba supervolcano, located in what's now Indonesia, erupted in one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years. Some researchers have proposed that the resulting global cooling and ash cover caused a severe population bottleneck across the entire human species, nearly wiping out early humans worldwide. based on genetic patterns that suggest a dramatic drop in population size around that same period. Other researchers strongly disagree, pointing to archaeological sites in India that show continuous human occupation directly above and below a layer of toba ash, suggesting local populations weathered the eruption without catastrophic disruption. The debate hasn't been resolved, and it's genuinely split specialists in the field for decades. What is clear is that human populations were already small and vulnerable during this stretch of history, whether or not toba specifically was the deciding factor. It's worth pausing on the actual decision-making involved here too, because it's easy to describe migration in the abstract and skip over how genuinely difficult the choice would have been. Leaving meant abandoning the only landscape your ancestors had ever known how to read. Which plants were safe? Which seasons brought which dangers? Generations of accumulated, hard-won environmental knowledge, all rendered useless the moment you crossed into unfamiliar territory. Staying meant betting that conditions would improve before they became unsurvivable. Neither option came with any guarantee, and the people making that choice had no way of knowing which one history would eventually vindicate. Once that first successful migration out of Africa took hold, the expansion accelerated in a way the earlier failed attempts never managed. Descendants of that founding population spread along southern coastlines toward South Asia, eventually reaching as far as Australia within tens of thousands of years, a crossing we've already covered in detail. Other groups pushed north and west into Europe, encountering and eventually replacing the Neanderthal populations already established there. Others moved east across Asia, eventually crossing into the Americas via a route that, at the time, wasn't even blocked by ocean at all. The coastal route in particular deserves its own explanation, because it solves a problem that would otherwise be hard to account for. Moving inland, across unfamiliar terrain, means constantly having to relearn which plants are edible, which animals are dangerous, and where reliable water sources are. Following a coastline solves most of that automatically. Shellfish, fish, and coastal vegetation are relatively consistent resources regardless of which specific stretch of coast you're standing on, and fresh water tends to be reachable via rivers reaching the sea. Researchers sometimes call this the coastal highway hypothesis, and it may explain how migrating groups covered such enormous distances, from the Arabian coast all the way to Southeast Asia in a comparatively short span of generations, without needing to reinvent their survival strategy at every single stop along the way. Every wave after that first successful crossing simply kept going, generation stacking on generation, spreading into environments as different from the African savanna as anything on Earth. Arctic tundra, dense rainforest, high-altitude plateaus, none of it was familiar. All of it eventually got settled anyway. The people who actually made that original crossing had no way of knowing any of this was coming. They weren't founding civilizations. They weren't thinking about descendants scattered across every continent on the planet, speaking thousands of unrelated languages, building cities on land they couldn't have imagined existed. They were following the only strategy that had ever mattered to their species. When the environment turns against you, and staying still means dying slowly, you move. And you hope the next place treats you better than the last one did. There's something worth noting about how this pattern compares to the boat crossings we've already covered. Both stories involve small groups making an irreversible decision under pressure, with no way to know in advance whether it would work. But the boat crossing to Sahul was driven primarily by curiosity and opportunity, a population expanding into new territory because the possibility existed. This migration out of Africa was driven by something closer to necessity. The land itself was failing to support the people living on it, and moving wasn't a choice made from ambition, it was survival, dressed up in retrospect as a great historic turning point. That distinction matters because it changes how we should think about the people who actually did it. They weren't visionaries chasing a bigger world. They were ordinary people responding to an ordinary problem: drought, scarcity, a landscape turning against them, using the only tool available to their entire species for solving that kind of problem. Move toward better conditions, and hope you get there before the old ones become fatal. What makes the story worth telling isn't the heroism of it, because there probably wasn't much heroism involved in the moment. It's the sheer improbability of the outcome. A drought-driven decision, made by a small group facing a genuinely difficult set of options, ended up determining the ancestry of essentially everyone alive today who isn't of African descent. Every language spoken outside Africa, every non-African culture, every non-African bloodline, all of it traces back through that single narrow funnel, shaped less by grand ambition than by rainfall patterns that stopped cooperating with the people trying to live off the land. They had no idea they were founding the rest of the human world. They just knew the rain had stopped, and it wasn't coming back anytime soon.